Hey everyone, I know I haven't made a video in like a month, but there's a new season upon us, which means new tier lists, new DPS metas to test, and of course new endgame analyses to be made. So speaking of tier lists, today we're going to be going over all of the new legendary weapons that are coming out this season. Now, a disclaimer, some of these new legendary weapons are new Festival of the Lost and Dawning weapons, which are technically in the API and were revealed in the dev gameplay commentary trailer thing. However, I know some of you don't like spoilers, so for those of you who, that's not your cup of tea, this is your warning. Be warned, okay? Because I'm not going to bring it up again, and they will come up in this video, and I'm not going to give you another warning. So if that's not your cup of tea, this is your warning. Be warned. Okay, so moving on, let's actually go ahead and look at the changelog for this season. Season 25, you can see here, it's just 1 page long, right? Pretty short. Last season, of course, we had way more changes to make. The tier list was way worse, in my opinion. Crazy, right? I mean, the sniper changes alone were longer than every change combined that we're making this season. So much less videos to make this season. I'm going to be combining these special, power, and primary videos into one video, hopefully, because it looks way shorter this season. So let's go over it, shall we? Okay, let's start off with shotguns. So shotguns, we have 2 reprises and I believe 4 new shotguns this season, so 6 in total. Let's start with the 2 reprises. So first we have Prophet of Doom. Now, Prophet of Doom is a reprise weapon from Garden of Salvation. It's craftable now, and I decided to move it up 2 tiers from D to B tier. And the reason for that is this. Prophet of Doom, before it was a precision frame pellet shotgun, which is the worst archetype in the game, mathematically speaking. However, precision frame shotguns, they can be okay because they can have stuff like 1-2 punch and they can still be usable, right? Prophet of Doom did not really have any great perks. I think it had like slideways 1-2 punch, which is pretty bad. However, it now has a bunch of decent perks in the first column. So let's go ahead and take a look at what it has. It has Reconstruction, Envious Arsenal, and Pugilist, along with 1-2 punch, Trench Barrel, and Cascade Point. And on top of that, with Anti-Barrier Shotgun this season, there's potentially some synergy with the Photo Inhibition Origin trait as well, which is not too bad. Now, is this the best weapon from Garden of Salvation's reprise? Certainly not, but it's pretty decent, right? I've decided to put it right next to Compass Rose, which is kind of the same shotgun, right? They're different elements, obviously, but decent first column, great second column, decent origin trait, precision frame, right? So it kind of makes sense. They're right next to each other in the tier list. They are both B tier. Next up, we have Sojourner's Tale. Now, Sojourner's Tale, the reprise that they gave to this thing, it's not as good, right? Now, Sojourner's Tale, for those of you who were not around during Splicer, was basically the go-to solar damage slug. And slugs have gotten a lot worse in the meta since then. And so Bungie has changed this perk pool so that it no longer includes Frenzy, which was like the consistent slug damage perk on this weapon, and it now has Precision Instrument. Now, I'm not a big fan of PI on this weapon because slugs have a pretty slow fire rate, so it's going to take you a long time to get to max stacks. They don't have like a crazy big mag size, and so because of this, you don't even have like Reconstruction or something, so you're going to run into at your max stacks of PI at the really bottom end of your mag. So not a great user of Precision Instrument, on top of the fact that this is ignoring that generally with slugs, you don't tend to fire them consecutively anyway. You tend to either use them as a swap weapon or just to whip it out and just shoot an enemy, 1-shot it or 2-shot it and pull it back into your inventory, right? So generally speaking, not a great user of Precision Instrument. However, they did give it Discord and Incandescent, and in my opinion, Slug Shotgun, that archetype, is probably one of the best users of Discord. High burst damage per shot, generally pretty easy to use, good crit modifier. You can use it on stuff like knights or whatever to just like 1-shot them to the head. So I think, I've been a Discord Glazer since day one. You guys know this. Since the perk came out, I was like, yo, this looks pretty cool. There's a lot of weapons that are single target that, you can blame them for not being splashy. You can blame them for having ammo issues if you want to use them for ad clear. Discord kind of solves that problem. And paired with a perk like Incandescent, I think Sojourner's Tale is, potentially usable in some niche builds, or if you want to give it a try. I think it's one of the better users of Discord. So I decided to give it a C tier and not D tier. Kind of interesting, but certainly not the go-to solar slug. That's actually a mantle that's been passed on to a different slug right above it, and that's not next in the list, but it's right here, so we may as well talk about it, right? Legato 11 solar slug. This thing has auto, vorpal, and cascade point, so an excellent successor to the old Sojourner's Tale, which only had frenzy. And the cascade point is interesting on slugs, and this is the first solar slug we've gotten with these perks, so pretty cool. It also has heal clip incandescent, which is just like what Sojourner's has, and has deconstruct as well. If you want to use it on something like a tank or some other sort of vehicle, it's usable there as well. So the only problem with these 2 weapons, well, mostly with the first weapon, right? Because the second weapon is not a damage weapon anyway. But the big problem with these 2 weapons is that they're slugs, right? And slugs are just not as favored in the meta right now. So I'm forced to give them C tier, even though the perk pull in Legato is not too bad, right? It's not the worst thing in the world. Next up, we have Scavenger's Fate. Now, Scavenger's Fate, I've decided it's a new weapon. I'm going to move it into the D tier. And the reason for that is because Scavenger's Fate is basically trying to do what Sojourner's Tale is doing, except it is not really kind of built the same way. Sojourner's Tale, it's a Discord add clear weapon, right? Discord add clear perk weapon. Scavenger's Fate is a Discord add clear perk weapon, but it's a precision frame pellet shotgun, which is way worse than slugs in terms of being able to one-shot enemies in the same way. And you know, it's just not particularly great. You know, the add clear perk destabilizing rounds is a bit worse than incandescent. Even after the destabilizing stealth buff, I think Discord incandescent, especially at the rate you're going to be killing ads with something like Sojourners and incandescent, I think you're going to run into that limitation fairly quickly, and so I don't think it's really worth using on a weapon like this, which is why this is in the D tier and why Sojourners is in the C tier. Okay, next up we have Deadlock, which I have skipped over and I'm going to come back to it now. And Deadlock is a new shotgun from Comp. It's a precision frame shotgun in the kinetic slot. It's stasis. And it has Grave Robber, 1-2 punch, and Cascade points. Surprisingly, even though it is a PvP shotgun, they give it some decent PvE perks. Now the thing is, it's still not great, right? It doesn't have any origin trait because it's a comp weapon. It has stocks instead. And, you know, it's just not that great, right? I mean, compared to Prophet of Doom is the same archetype. It just has way more perks in both columns that are potentially useful. But I did have to put this in the B tier because it is, I would say, strictly better than something like a Retold or a Matador. Lead from Gold is a lot worse than Grave Robber. And of course, it does have access to Cascade Point, even though I think that's not that great on a pellet shotgun like this. So, you know, a bit of a neither here nor there type of thing. But I do think it is deserving of being in the B tier, which is where there's a lot of shotguns where they're usable, technically speaking, but you probably wouldn't use them in the current meta, or they're worse than something else in the A or S tier, just strictly speaking. So I don't think it deserves to be in like the C tier with something like a Legato or like a Retold, but it's certainly not good enough to hang with like the A tier. So bottom of B tier I think makes sense. Okay, so next up we have Deadweight. Now Deadweight is an old shotgun. Nothing changed about the shotgun. I just decided to move it from S to A tier. And the reason for that is because I was just looking at the shotguns here. And in my opinion, right, if Ikelos SG didn't exist, Deadweight would probably be S tier. But Ikelos SG does exist. And more as we get more and more enhanced weapons, it's kind of just these days, like the core assumption is that you're going to be able to enhance a weapon. And so Deadweight not having access to enhanced 1-2 punch, Frenzy is not particularly that useful on rapid fire shotguns. Surrounded is pretty niche. I just think it's not as good as the stuff in S tier, right? Until its return, you have similar first column as Deadweight, except instead of 1-2 punch, you substitute it for enhanced Cascade Point and enhanced Surrounded and you know, all this stuff, right? So I think, you know, until its return is generally like a lot more useful than Deadweight, especially given the slot it occupies. So Deadweight, I think it does deserve to be in the A tier, even if it is at the top of the A tier. And then finally, our last shotgun is going to be Arcane Embrace. Now, Arcane Embrace, this is the new Festival of the Lost shotgun, and it was revealed in the dev commentary gameplay. They were using it on top of Alethanim, and this thing is a heavy burst shotgun. And if you guys know me, and you guys know that I've been talking about archetypes recently in this game, heavy burst archetypes and new archetypes in general tend to power creep old archetypes. So the way this heavy burst shotgun works, if you guys haven't seen the commentary footage, it's basically a slug that fires 2 shots at once. It's like a heavy burst hand cannon, basically. And, you know, knowing Bungie, this thing is probably going to do more total damage than any shotgun archetype in the game. Its DPS is probably going to be below rapids, but above regular slugs, so it's probably going to be pretty decent. And normally when Bungie introduces a new archetype, they don't overload its perk pool because they want to reveal another version of that archetype with better perks. This weapon's perk pool is already pretty good. It has 4 times the charm on a precision weapon, which means it's already going to be very competitive total damage wise. It has precision instrument, which is, I would say, decent on this shotgun in particular because of 4 times the charm, giving you basically pseudo reloads on top of having a heavy burst, right? Which means you're going to be able to proc precision instruments max stacks a lot faster than something like, you know, a regular slug. A much better abuser of precision instrument than something like Sojourner's Tale. So I think this thing is potentially not meta warping, but like pretty good, pretty strong. And I'm always excited to see Bungie make new legendary weapons that break the mold of legendary weapon rules. For example, shotguns don't really have like a sustained damage archetype, and they don't really have like a solo damage role where you're just using the shotgun over and over. They're more of like a complement to other weapons or a component of like swap rotations, whereas Arcane Embrace seems like a weapon that is actually going to be fairly decent if you just shoot it by itself straight. Okay, so that's pretty much it for shotguns. Let's move on to snipers next. So snipers, we have a lot less changes. It's just 4 changes, and 2 of them are already existing weapons. So first we have Omniscient Eye. Now, Omniscient Eye is probably one of the biggest glow-ups I've ever seen of any weapon from a reprise. It was in the F tier before, And the reason for that was because it was a 140 sniper with basically no PvE perks. It had like Mulligan, Outlaw, Snapshot. It was horrible. Okay, horrible. However, what did they decide to give it? I did talk about this in previous videos. I was like, yo, Bungie, buff Omniscient Eye, give it like 4 times the charm, Precision Instrument, give it Vorpal. Guess what they gave it? 4 times the charm, Precision Instrument, and Vorpal, and Envious Arsenal as well, right? So pretty cool. I'm a big fan of this weapon. This is basically the shoe-in. It's better than Tumulus, better than Twilight Oath, better than Ikelos SR, better than all of them combined. So pretty good. The origin trait I think is not particularly great on a sniper, but who cares, right? Perks are really great. It's a rapid fire, enhanceable, solar. We love it, right? Great matches with Apex Predator, the whole thing, right? Obviously, Still Hunt is kind of taken over the solar sniper slot, but if you don't want to use an exotic or something and you're using a 140 sniper instead, this is good for like, day one situations too, because of 4 times the charm. So it's a good straight firing weapon. It's a good swap weapon because of Envious and Vorpal. Usable, great. 140 snipers for damage, not the most compelling thing right now, but pretty good, pretty good. Next up, I'm going to skip to Macabre, and the reason for that is because this thing is also a reprised weapon, so in the same vein. They didn't really change this thing's perks that much. It has triple tap and firing now. I believe it used to have Volt Shot. I don't think this thing is a good Volt Shot weapon anymore. It doesn't have auto-loading. I think it used to have auto-loading. So yeah, they changed its perks a little bit, and they kind of made it more standard, to be honest with you. So I'm really not in the business of changing where this thing is going. It is enhanceable, so I should change that. It's now enhanceable. But yeah, I'm not really in the business of changing the placement of this thing. It's kind of triple tap firing is super standard for everything else that's in the D tier. You can see it here on Silicon Neuroma. So I'm just going to leave it here. Origin trait's horrible. It's just not a great weapon, right? Aggressive sniper with triple tap firing, pretty awful. Okay, next up we have 2 new snipers, and in my opinion, these 2 have the potential to be game warping. So we have Valletta F, which is an aggressive void sniper with air trigger, Withering Gaze, Hawkeye breach armaments, and Sovereignty, which is a similar sniper. It's basically a decent first column, not really ammo related first column, and then Withering Gaze, and then an okay origin trait, right? Now, the big thing with these weapons is Withering Gaze. Now, for those of you that don't know, Withering Gaze is a perk where basically you can ADS for a little bit, like box breathing. And I haven't seen extensive testing on this perk yet. The language implies that it's going to be the same ADS timing as box breathing, which is 1.5 seconds, which is not that bad. Not that bad, by the way, for a full weekend. So if this weapon doesn't have an internal cooldown on using Withering Gaze, and you can repeatedly weaken as soon as the old weaken has expired, this weapon is potentially game warping, right? Now, I did say when I was streaming and talking about making this tier list, I did say that weaken is really easy to access these days, and so it's not really a big deal if you don't use Withering Gaze and you decide to use like Prismatic and use like snare bombs or weakening grenades to give yourself that consistent weaken. But the fact that this is like an exotic level effect, right? Just being able to weaken on command just for ADSing, and it's not like the first shot in your mag or anything like that, so you don't need auto loading. I don't know, this thing is potentially game warping in my opinion. Does need to do a bit more testing, I think, to really make sure. But the fact that you can essentially have a weaken on like a boss just for switching to this weapon, doesn't even have to be full mag, ADSing for a bit, shooting one shot, and then swapping off and using other weapons. And one of the least contested DPS slots, by the way. This is the energy slot, right? Outside of like Still Hunt, not that contested. I would say, pretty strong, right? Using this with like an exotic heavy, pretty good idea, I think. This is just on paper, like it's a free high quality of life weekend, like I've written here in the notes. Yeah, I think it is game warping. I mean, only time will tell. I think more testing needs to be done on this perk. But as it stands, unless there's some weird, caveat, like the weaken is 3 seconds or something, or you have to be ADS for way longer than, is expected. Yeah, I do think this perk is pretty strong. I think it is pretty strong, and it's enough, even with the other perks being not that great, it's enough to really, I think, bump these weapons into the S tier. I mean, I was comparing these things to like Succession and Omniscient Eye and Irukandji, and I was like, which one are you more likely to use? It's definitely the weakened sniper, right? It's definitely the weakened sniper. I don't know if these are so versatile that I'm willing to put them over Supremacy, which comes with kinetic tremors, bait and switch, etc, etc. But I think it is definitely like, it's more useful than like an overload hit scan sniper, to be quite honest with you, right? A weakened sniper that's weakened on command is way more generally universally relevant than something like, oh, I can send overloads in one shot, right? So yeah, that's it for snipers. Let's move on to fusions. Fusions, only 3 changes this season, right? We have Zealot's Reward, which is another reprise, another big glow up here, went from E all the way to S tier. And the reason for that is Zealot's Reward had basically no good PvE perks, even though it was a rapid fire fusion, which is the best archetype in the game. And we bumped it all the way to the S tier because it is basically the scatter signal of the energy slot. It has a reservoir burst, it has controlled burst, it doesn't have an overflow perk, which is a bit unfortunate, but it does have auto-loading holster, it has lead from gold, it has destabilizing rounds. I wish they gave this thing reconstruction or overflow or envious, or either envious really. But they didn't, but it's still good, right? I mean, compared to something like a Cartesian, we've been waiting for a Vorpal replacement, and people use Cartesian, and that thing doesn't have overflow or envious or reconstruction. So if that's thing in A tier, and you know this thing has even better damage perks, obviously this thing's going to be in S tier. So not much to say about Zealot's Reward. Let's move on to Plug 1 and Glacio. Glacio is getting an updated perk pool here. We have Envious Assassin now on this weapon, which is, you know, good on a fusion with controlled burst or reservoir burst. It also has Withering Gaze. Now, Glacio is a bit interesting because Withering Gaze, the downside of high impact fusions is their charge time, right? And if Withering Gaze works like a lot of other perks, which require you to not fire but only aim, the charge time of the high impact fusion should be able to fit in that Withering Gaze delay time, which means you can switch to this weapon and you can start charging it up after maybe like half a second, and that full second of you waiting for your fusion to charge is part of that Withering Gaze wait time. And if that's the case, then I think this is definitely deserving of being in the A tier, because you're basically bypassing the entire downside of using a high impact fusion, and you're just getting that nice high burst of damage, which is probably more than something like an adaptive sniper. It's probably more worth using. So this is potentially, you know, good for, you know, more close range bosses that you want to weaken, compared to something like the 90 and the 72 RPM snipers that have Withering Gaze instead, which are the other obvious choices with this perk. We also have, of course, Plug 1, and Plug 1 is right below this. Plug 1, they give it Slideways, which is buff Slideways acts like Slide Shot, right? You can reload once per slide, which is pretty nice. And you have Reconstruction as well, which wasn't on this weapon before. Before, we had almost exclusively like PvP perks along with like Feeding Frenzy on Plug 1. I'm glad they finally decided to give their Nightfall tier weapon a much better and well-deserved set of first column perks, so I'm pretty happy with that. Obviously, we also have Reservoir, Controlled, and Volt Shot as well, which are all pretty decent perks, especially the first two. So, you know, definitely deserving of being in the A tier, even if it's a precision frame. Like I mentioned in my archetype video, precision frame fusion rifles are easily the worst in the game. However, you know, really good perk set here, and if we compare it to stuff in like the B tier or the C tier, definitely more worth using in my opinion. So yeah, that's it for fusion rifles. Let's go ahead and move on to Breach GLs. Okay, Breach GLs, we have, I believe, 5 updates here to the tier list. And some of them are kind of just me changing my preferences in terms of what I think is the best in the meta. 2 of these are actually new weapons though. So Ignition Code is a returning weapon from Season of the Splicer. The significant perks, namely Slide Shot on this weapon, didn't really change. I mean, you did get the Origin trait, which doesn't really affect this weapon because you don't really tend to manually reload your GL that has Slide Shot. And so yeah, Slide Shot, Lead from Gold Frenzy. I mean, yeah, this is just a classic for people that missed out on a Slide Shot blinding GL. Now you have it available to you again, so go grab it if you want it. But I don't think it's moving out of the B tier because its perks basically didn't change, and my opinion of this weapon didn't really change either. Still a solid blinding GL, but there's other blinding GLs that have more interesting perks these days. Next up, we have Liturgy. Now, Liturgy is a double fire stasis GL, so the first double fire that we've gotten in the kinetic slot. It has Slideways, buff Slideways, which is basically Slide Shot. We have Envious Arsenal, and we have Chill Clip, Lead from Gold, and Chain Reaction. So this thing is basically Lingering Dread, but better, right? It has Enhanceable. All these perks are enhanceable. It's a double fire, which means it's easier to hit your Chill Clip shots to slow for something like an Overload. And I think Envious Arsenal makes this thing usable for DPS. If you want to use it for like triple swapping with something like a rocket or something like that, I do kind of have to test this more. But I do think Liturgy is deserving of being in the S tier for now, strictly because of its versatility. You can use it for overload stunning. You could potentially use it for a damage rotation. It's an easy way to apply Chill Clip, and it does have Slideways Lead from Gold, which does make it a usable option for stuff like GMs where you need a blinding GL with a lot of potential blast radius, as it is a double fire. So the remaining 3 changes that I made to Breach GLs this season, I decided to shift 3 different GLs. So first we have Lost Signal, which I've shifted into the S tier. After seeing all the solo content, low man content, after doing damage testing and building Transcendence for myself for damage rotations last season over and over, I can confidently say Lost Signal just disproportionately gives more darkness energy given the damage that it deals to targets compared to other weapons. A lot of people have been saying that they tested Transcendence building properly and that it's really just damage based. I really just don't believe this to be true. For example, something like Microcosm builds Transcendence way faster on bosses than something like a Nighthawk, right? If you Nighthawk a boss, you get like 1/3 of your bar. It doesn't make any sense to me. Whereas doing the same amount of damage with like a Microcosm is like you get your Transcendence. I don't understand really how it works, but Lost Signal seems to give way more darkness energy proportionally given the damage that it does compared to other darkness weapons. And this is really noticeable when you shoot a group of ads. There's nothing that builds darkness Transcendence quite like Lost Signal, to the point where like you are kind of building Transcendence so often that you should use this weapon in a damage rotation even if the damage is not that great. You should use it just to get your Transcendence back so you have Weaken up again and Nades up again and stuff like that. So yeah, Lost Signal, pretty strong option. I decided to put it in the S tier. I think it is kind of like meta defining, at least until we get another sort of area denial frame that is either in the kinetic or the energy slot. Mountaintop, I decided to move it to S tier, and the reason for that is because I'm shifting it out of the way of Martyrs. Now, Martyrs used to be the only S tier weapon, and I've introduced these 3 weapons into the S tier instead of Martyrs being in the S tier, and the reason is this. Martyrs Retribution, great perks, Heal Clip, Incandescent, Kill Clip, Demo, ALH. The only problem with it is that it is a wave frame, and wave frames are still just not that great. I wouldn't consider them to be meta warping or meta defining in the same way that like an area denial generates Transcendence energy, or like in the versatility of Liturgy, or like the movement potential of Mountaintop, as well as the burst damage that it provides. Micro Missile is still the best frame for GLs in the game, for special GLs. So yeah, Martyr's Retribution still, you know, it's good. It's got easily the best perk pool of any wave frame we've ever had ever. But I still think wave frames are just not as impactful as these 3 frames right here, at least if we're talking about, you know, how likely are you to actually use them in endgame content, which is like the whole point of this tier list. So last season, I think I got a little too enamored with the Martyr's Retribution perk pool, thinking it was really good. But again, it is a wave frame, and I think these other frames are more significantly impactful in endgame content, at least right now. Okay, next up we have Glaives. Glaives, there's only 2 changes. We have one new glaive, which is Rake Angle, and then we have a new version of Albedo Wing, which is of course the Dawning Glaive. I just realized this is enhanceable and I forgot to change that. Okay, so Rake Angle is the new Nightfall weapon this season. It is the first kinetic slot glaive in the game. It has Impulse Amplifier, Chill Clip, Lead from Gold, Close to Melee, and Stunning Recovery. Basically what I'm telling you is this thing has basically every good perk on a glaive that you could ever want. The only problem is that it's an aggressive glaive, which means the handling and the stats on this thing are going to be pretty terrible compared to most generally used glaives. Any season where you have like Unstoppable Glaive or like Anti-Barrier Glaive, this thing can stun overloads instantly and fully reload itself with post-buff Stunning Recovery. So really good for GMs for sure. Anytime there's any overload in your GM, this is like free overload glaive essentially. And the other perks are not bad either, right? You have Impulse and Lead from Gold. Excellent glaive. I just put in the S tier because glaives, generally speaking, are just like not useful, and I think a glaive having Chill Clip and being available in a slot where you typically would use like another less useful weapon, this is probably the most viable glaive in the game, even though perk wise it's not like, I guess, super impressive or super crazy unique or anything like that. So I decided to put it as the rank 1 spot in the S tier. And finally, Albedo Wing. I don't think I really moved it. Yeah, I think I just left it in the A tier. There's some nice new perks on this thing, like Air Trigger, for example, which I think is pretty decent on a glaive, but there's nothing standout. And of course, like I said before, it is the worst glaive frame in the game. Aggressive frames just feel generally pretty awful to use with their really mediocre stats. And so, yeah, that's why I decided to put Albedo Wing and just leave it in the A tier and not change its placement. Okay, a little surprise for you guys. I've also made a rocket sidearm tier list. Now, some of the people in my chat were pointing out the fact that, hey, you made a trace tier list when there were only 4 traces in the game, so you can't really make that excuse for rocket sidearms now that we have 4 rocket sidearms in the game. So let me go ahead and show you guys what's going on over here. So rocket sidearms, I think this is, you know, fairly clear here. I don't think anyone's surprised by this. You know, Aberrant Action is rank 1, S tier, Heal Clip, Incandescent, really only the only relevant perk combination on that rocket sidearm. We have the new rocket sidearm from Iron Banner, Tenacious Mastery. This thing is really nice, actually. It has Chill Clip, really easy overload stun, 2-tap freeze, super easy to do with a weapon like a rocket sidearm. You have Air Trigger, which is really nice on a rocket sidearm. Reserve Nerf obviously hit these things pretty hard. Air Trigger helps make up some of that back with the enhanced version. And the air reload is really easy to trigger. You're jumping all the time while using rocket sidearms. So Air Trigger, you know, jumping while reloading is maybe not the best idea on some weapon types, but on a rocket sidearm, totally see it happening. Indebted Kindness, because of its Volt Shot potential, and as well as having Impulse and Lead, great first column, deserving of being in the A tier as well. And then finally B tier, I put the Call in here. The Call doesn't really have any strong splash perks. Hatchling is awful, I didn't even include it here. And Slice is useful, I mean, great utility in the first column, but the only reason people are using the Call, in my opinion, other than for like dealer's choice synergy for, you know, super building in some really niche scenarios, was because it was the only kinetic slot, you know, rocket sidearm. And I do think Tenacious Mastery in general has better perks overall and is more likely to be used going on into the future. So yeah, probably people are going to be farming Iron Banner for this thing. Obviously the origin trait is not as good, but Chill Clip is absolutely excellent, and Air Trigger is great as well for the neutral benefits. Okay, moving on, let's actually talk about power weapons now. So power weapons, machine guns, we have, I don't think we have any new machine guns this season. Yeah, I don't think so. But we do have 2 machine guns that have changed their perk pools. So Archon's Thunder, which was the Iron Banner machine gun, is no longer solar. It is now a stasis high impact machine gun, so it competes with stuff like Culems. Now Archon's Thunder used to be really bad. I think the best perk it had was like Rampage in the second column, which is really outdated. So it was in the E tier. It got a big glow up and it's now in the A tier. And the reason for that is it has Air Trigger, Rhyme Stealer, 4 times a charm in the first column. If you don't know what Rhyme Stealer does, it gives you frost armor when you kill a frozen target or a stasis crystal with this weapon. Now it's only 1 stack of frost armor, so it's not that great. I think Rhyme Stealer is pretty overrated, but if you were to pick a weapon to use with Headstone as like a weapon that can consistently kill frozen targets and generate crystals, I think a high impact machine gun is kind of as close as you're going to get. I know a lot of people are hyping up Primaries with Rhyme Stealer. I think that's pretty overrated, but I think a machine gun is potentially a decent user of Rhyme Stealer, at least in my opinion. We have Headstone up next. Headstone, obviously great on a stasis machine gun, really easy to proc with high impacts given their slow fire rate and very easy precision requirement. We have Desperate Measures, Air Trigger, which is just, you know, generally pretty good. You have Killing Tally, just a good neutral weapon. The only thing that's missing really is a good like simulated reload perk rather than a manual reload perk. So, you know, that's the only thing it's missing. That's why it's not in the S tier. But besides that, high impact's one of the more favored archetypes in the machine gun family. It's enhanceable, doesn't have any reserve issues. It has, you know, field prep adjacent perk. It has 4 times charm, Rhyme Stealer, Headstone, all these good neutral perks. And so that's why it's going to land in the A tier. Next up, we have Avalanche. Avalanche, I haven't changed its tier placement. It does get Dragonfly and Incandescent now, which is a bit of a unique combination, but I don't know if they fixed the reserves. And even if they have, I really think this weapon is lacking any sort of reload perk. So, I mean, it's kind of in the same spot as like Hammerhead, where like, you know, it has double damage perks, but you're going to suffer in reload. And I do think the origin trait is a bit worse as well. So Avalanche, it's decent, it's fine, but I don't think it's deserving of moving out of the B tier at this point. It's kind of similar to Recurrent Impact in that it has like Subsistence and then no really good like simulated reload perk, and then some decent neutral perks as well, right? Even though I think Recurrent Impact does have the better origin trait. Alright, next up we have Heavy GLs or Drum GLs. Now Drum GLs, much like Snipers, most of the new entries are going to be in the S tier, but we'll get there when we get there. First, I want to talk about one thing, which is the Rapid Fire Frame buff. The Rapid Fire Frame has received, I believe, a 7% buff across the board, which Rapid Fires were already higher DPS than Adaptives. This is just giving them an even bigger lead, which is going to make Rapid Fires a lot better this season. Now, unfortunately, we don't really have any good Rapid Fires, like really solid Rapid Fires with good perks. They gave us 2 new Adaptives instead of making one of these a Rapid, and they give us Envious Arsenal with Bait and Switch, which is obviously really great, but it would have been nice if one of these was like a Rapid, right? But anyways, I decided to move some of the rapid fires which I placed in lower tiers up a tier because of this 7% increase. Specifically, Love and Death is moving up because it has auto full court. It's a rapid fire. I decided to also move up A Cosmic. Now, A Cosmic is also getting new perks as a result of being a Festival of the Lost weapon, I believe. Yeah, it's getting some new perks. The only problem with A Cosmic is that Withering Gaze doesn't really make sense on a Heavy GL in my opinion, and the other perks are kind of dated, right? Clown Cartridge is really dated on a Heavy GL. You really want to look for something like Auto Loading or Envious Arsenal. And Air Trigger is fine if you're going to use this for something like a GM with like Air Trigger Explosive Light. But again, this thing is really good. It's just, it's a rapid fire too, right? Which is excellent. It's just missing a good reload perk. If it had a good reload perk, it would easily be the best Heavy GL in the game. It just doesn't have a good reload perk. I really wish it did. But, you know, it is what it is. You know, can't ask for everything, right? In addition to Love and Death and A Cosmic moving up, I decided to move 2 adaptives down, Regnant and Wendigo GL3. That's because, you know, I think it was kind of a mistake to put them in the A tier to begin with because they're not really in the same tier as Cataphract in terms of usability. They have 1 mag perks like Explosive and Cascade, and Wendigo doesn't even have Envious, right? But I think this adaptive rapid change has really kind of sealed the nail in the coffin for them, right? I think Cataphract is really the only kind of usable adaptive in the A tier that remains. I think these do deserve to be in the B tier. I mean, Explosive Light and Cascade Point Cascade Point is fine for rotations, but you have Edge Transit, of course, and Explosive Light is at an all-time low in terms of interest and usability in heavy GLs, given that we have much more consistent damage perks now. So yeah, Regnant Wendigo, I think it makes sense for them to be in the B tier, and so I've decided to move them down as such, with Rapids like a Cosmic, Marsilia, and Caraxes being in the A tier with slightly worse damage perks but more consistency and a better archetype. Finally, the last two stars of the show that we got to talk about today, Bittersweet and Wicked Sister. Now, Envious Arsenal, if you guys have not heard, I'm obviously going to make updates to the perk tier list. I'm going to talk about this perk when we get there, but Envious Arsenal is, of course, the new kid on the block. And the way this perk works, if you guys haven't heard, is you damage a target with the other two weapons in your inventory, then you swap back to this weapon, and this weapon gets fully loaded. Now, I don't think I need to tell you why that's really strong with a perk like Bait and Switch. Super easy to use this thing on basically any class as long as you're willing to do some sort of swap rotation. Any class, no dodge or reload, nothing of the sort, no envious stacking, no annoying, you know, having to deal with loadout swaps and Envious Assassin being annoying. So this is just really strong. And yeah, I don't think I really need to say much else. These two basically share the exact same god roll. The only difference is, of course, that Bittersweet, I believe, has slightly better reserves, being a weapon that's seasonal rather than a strike weapon. So yeah, both farmable, both good. I guess it just really depends on what affinity you want or whether you care about getting the slightly better version because, I mean, they're both enhanceable. This one, I think, just has slightly better reserves, right? Slightly better stats. Yeah, that's basically it for heavy GLs. I don't think I really need to tell you why these are as good as they are. Envious Arsenal is just the best reload perk in the game right now for DPS rotations, and the other perks that these things have are just great as well. So yeah, that's pretty much it for heavy GLs. Let's go ahead and move on to swords. Now swords, we actually didn't get any new swords this season at all. Not even like changed swords, I believe, besides Zephyr. And Zephyr got Attrition Orbs and Rhyme Stealer on top of the other perks that it already had, which were good. And so I decided to move Zephyr into the A tier next to Ill Omen, which basically has the same god roll, besides not having Cold Steel and being a slightly better archetype in my opinion. So yeah, Zephyr is up here now in the A tier. I don't think there's any controversy with that. We're going to leave it there. And we're going to move on to Rockets. Now, Rockets, there's only 2 new rockets this season. I haven't really changed the position of any other rocket, and that's going to be Tomorrow's Answer and Heretic's Fervor. Now, Tomorrow's Answer is the more interesting of the two. Now, a lot of people are saying this thing is dead on arrival because it's a high impact frame. Now, let me remind you of this, right? If this thing was an aggressive frame or an adaptive frame, it would be the best rocket in the game, no contest. However, it's a high impact frame, but it has Envious Arsenal. And I think Envious Arsenal, what you guys are missing is that this perk is especially good on rockets, right? Heavy GLs, you know, they have a lot of shots in their mag and you can go for multiple seconds without needing to worry about reloading them. Rockets, once you shoot them, you're done. You're done, right? And so Envious Arsenal, from what I've been told and from what people's testing that I've seen, there's no internal cooldown to its effect, which means, theoretically speaking, you can get 2 slug shotguns and this rocket and go 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 over and over and over and over and over. And that is going to be some potentially really high DPS. So when I get my hand on a Tomorrow's Answer, I will definitely test that rotation and let you guys know how good it is. But I'm expecting it to be pretty damn good. So definitely keep an eye out for this one. Even if, you know, the rotation doesn't end up being that great, this thing's perks are excellent, right? Air Trigger is great and stuff like gems on a rocket. Withering Gaze is like, it's fine, right? It's fine on a rocket, especially in the first column rather than the second column. It's definitely fine. So I think it's deserving of being in the S tier. If it ends up being like super competitive DPS, I'm even willing to move this thing to rank 1 because, you know, frame be damned, Envious Arsenal looks like it's going to be really strong on specifically rockets because they're a 1 mag type with a really punishing reload time. So I don't know, with how much reconstruction has been nerfed and stuff like that, I think Tomorrow's Answer is Season 25's answer. So I think it could be potentially really good. Obviously, Apex Predator has Slideways, which has been buffed as well. But I do think sliding during damage is kind of troll. I know a lot of people meme on me for showing off that slide shot surrounded crux rotation and stuff, but just to remind you, I did say that, you know, sliding in front of your teammates is kind of troll, right? So I'm not recommending that you use like Slideways Apex or anything, or that it's meta defining or anything like that. So I do think Tomorrow's Answer is going to be like potentially really good. But, you know, we'll see what happens with that when people actually get their hands on it. Next up, we have Heretic's Fervor. Now, Heretic's Fervor is basically a Cold Comfort-ish rocket. It's an aggressive, it's stasis. So yeah, you're going to be basically comparing this thing directly to Cold Comfort. The way I like to think of this thing is it's enhanceable, and it's basically the GM version of Cold Comfort, right? Cold Comfort has Envious Bait and Switch, which are more DPS oriented. This thing has Bipod, Explosive Light, Field Prep, Slide Shot, Autoloading Holster, all kind of GM adjacent perks. So yeah, I think it really good GM perk, really good GM perks, really good GM rocket. I think Dark Aether Reaper is pretty good, I believe, as a neutral origin trait for stuff like GMs as well. So yeah, Heretic's Fervor, one of the best GM rockets in the game, definitely the best stasis GM rocket in the game. The only reason I have Cold Comfort above it right now is because Cold Comfort is usable for both. It's useful for both. Although yeah, I think you can make and the origin trait's pretty good for DPS as well. But you can make the argument that Heretic's Fervor maybe deserves to be above Cold Comfort, given how little Cold Comfort is used these days in anything, really, even in speedrunning. So yeah, that's pretty much it for rockets. Let's move on to linears. Linears, we have another sort of spoiler here. There is a new, I think it's a Dawning linear? Yeah, a new Dawning linear this season. And it is a Void Adaptive Burst called Mistral Lift. Now, this thing has Envious Assassin, Withering Gaze, Reconstruction, and Bait and Switch. And like I mentioned with the High Impact Fusion, I suppose you can delay your charge time a little bit and have that be part of the Withering Gaze kind of, you know, charge up time. But I really do think it makes more sense to use Withering Gaze on something like a sniper or, you know, a special weapon rather than your heavy weapon, and not waste that perk slot. You definitely want your perk slot to be more reload adjacent and allow something like your sniper to just waste a little time, shoot off one shot and weaken, so that you can have that weaken for the rest of your reserves on your, you know, kinetic and power weapon, for example. So anyways, Mistral Lift, I decided to put in the S tier. And the reason for that is I think it is better than Doom Petitioner. I think Bait and Switch is significantly better than Precision Instrument, because Bait and Switch is active as soon as you're done shooting the first of the 3 shots in your first burst, whereas Precision Instrument takes at least, I think, 3 shots to fully proc. So, you know, kind of a big difference over a long period of time. In addition to the fact that Bait and Switch can persist across, you know, multiple mags, Precision Instrument, as soon as you swap off the weapon, it's chalked, right? I think Vice Stinger is a better origin trait than Dragon's Vengeance as well, and the rest of the perks are pretty much the same, right? So I think Mistral Lift, it kind of has that ease of use factor that Doom Petitioner doesn't, right? You can kind of just pull it out and use it whenever, and you know, you don't have to worry about Precision Instrument resetting or anything like that. So yeah, Mistral Lift, I mean, I still think linears are obviously really bad. We've talked about this recently in the archetype analysis video, but Mistral Lift is definitely one of the better linears in the game. I don't think it's as good as Scintillation, because Scintillation, I think Rewind Rounds is better than everything in the first column on Mistral Lift, but they're pretty similar, and I would consider Mistral Lift to be a viable stand-in, viable alternative. That's just a different element. They're basically the same thing. So that's it for heavy weapons. Let's talk about primaries next. Now, primaries, we don't tier list them. We kind of just go best in slot versus alternative. So if I don't mention a primary in this list here, that means I've looked at it and assumed that it's not going to be as good as the stuff that we already have on this list. Some primaries from this season, I've put them in the notes here if you're interested. For example, like Destabilizing One for All, Reckless Oracle. But if it's not a primary or a secondary option here, as in like a best in slot versus alternative, I have not included it in the changelog. So there are 6 primaries, I believe, that I've included here that I think are notable. So let's talk about them. So first we have Anonymous Autumn. Now, Anonymous Autumn is an arc lightweight sidearm, and in my opinion, it's just a better version of Brigand's Law. Brigand's Law has Threat Detector and Feeding Frenzy Volt Shot. This thing has Eddy Current, Demolitionist, Attrition Orbs, Volt Shot, Frenzy, and Desperate Measures, and it has a better archetype than the Rapid Fire Frame that Brigand's Law brings to the table. So as a result, Anonymous Autumn, just decided to put it here, it has a much better origin trait too. Field tested is leagues better than something like Right Hook. And so Anonymous Autumn, decided to put it here. I put Heliocentric as the alternative instead of shifting Brigand's Law down, because I think it brings something different to the table with its like Heal Clip Incandescent combo, and it's also a lightweight as well. So I just moved Brigand's Law completely out of the list, and so I hope you can understand why. I think these two sidearms do like slightly different things, but they're both very solid. Next up, we have Yesterday's Question, which I guess is the new Trials weapon, kind of the counterpart to Tomorrow's Answer. This is a heavy burst arc hand cannon. It has Rapid Hit and Vorpal for Lucky Pants stuff, with Lucky Pants no longer being tied to the elemental affinity of your subclass matching the elemental affinity of your hand cannon. You know, this finds maybe slightly more use. It is the best energy hand cannon for the job, given that Mahi's has Frenzy and this thing has Vorpal. The only problem is that Lucky Pants did get a nerf, and I'm going to be testing it like literally right after this video is over. But yeah, I mean, even still, I mean, yeah, it is the best hand cannon kind of in this role for boss damage, I suppose. And I decided to put Mahi as the alternative here. I just shifted it down since there wasn't an alternative previously. So yeah, I think this is a fairly straightforward choice. I mean, it's just better than Mahi's. So yeah, it's the damage hand cannon energy pick. Okay, next up in the energy pulse rifle, we have some interesting meta discussions to have, and that is Grid Skipper. Now, the reason why Grid Skipper has replaced Corrasion, despite my praise of the Heavy Burst Pulse Rifle archetype in the last season, is because Heavy Burst Pulses got like an 18% overall nerf, I believe, this season, which puts them right below Rapid Fire Pulses in terms of DPS. They have slightly longer range than Rapid Fire Pulses, but they are a bit worse in DPS now, which is why I've decided to put Grid Skipper above Corrasion. Grid Skipper, Repulsor Brace, we have newly buffed Void Overshields, which appear to be quite strong. Destabilizing Rounds is a decent splash perk post stealth buff, but I do think the Grid Skipper combo is a little bit more potent. For those of you that don't know, all of the returning Splicer weapons have an origin trait called Splicer Surge, which basically acts like a free reload perk on a weapon that you're going to have out a lot. And Grid Skipper is a primary, so you're going to have it out a lot, like the majority of the time, right? So you have Repulsor Brace for survivability, you have Destabilizing Rounds for splash, and then you have Splicer Surge for your reload as well. And so I think Grid Skipper is really the entire package. The only thing it's really missing is, I think, the potency of something like a Nullify, but Grid Skipper is definitely up there, which is why I decided to replace Corrasion as the alternative and put Corrasion into the notes instead. Next up for Kinetic Bows, this is probably less interesting, but Kinetic Bows, Accrued Redemption has retaken its top spot, and that's because it is the first bow in the game with Kinetic Tremors. I do not know how many shots it takes to proc Kinetic Tremors on a bow, but however many shots it is, I mean, it is an interesting new perk to have on a bow. Assuming it's like 2 or 3 or 4 shots and not like 7, should be pretty decent, honestly. I hope it's like 2, right? But should be pretty decent on a bow. Kinetic Tremors is a pretty solid perk. And of course, even if Kinetic Tremors doesn't work out, Firefly, I think this is the first bow to have Firefly as well. So yeah, you have the Archer's Tempo Explosive Head, classic dependable combo. You have these two perks, which are completely unique to this bow, which make it a much more interesting perk than the previously occupied Raconteur. Raconteur, I moved it into the alternative slot here, and I've kicked out Vengeful Whisper, which was only really here for niche reasons, and now that we have a clearly defined winner here in the kinetic slot, I think it makes sense to kick out that niche role, put Raconteur in the alternative with Accrued Redemption on top. So that's basically it. If any of you have any questions about this tier list, feel free to leave them in the comments. If you have any suggestions, maybe some primaries that I missed, feel free to also leave me some suggestions in the comments. As you guys know, like I've said in the past, this is an ongoing community effort. Every season, I want to improve the tier list until they're as close to perfect as possible. So if you guys think I've misplaced something in the special tier list, the heavy tier list, or even the primary options here, if you think I've, completely glazed over something, please let me know. I'll definitely update it next season with your feedback in mind. But with that being said, that's pretty much it. I will definitely update the perk tier list and, origin trait tier list, exotic weapon tier list, all that stuff when we get more info from the season. But this tier list, the weapon tier list, I usually do it first because it is the easiest to do, the most straightforward to do. Doesn't need too much research because it's fairly obvious which weapons are going to be strong and which weapons are not going to be as strong. So that's pretty much it. You guys have a good rest of your day and enjoy farming tonics.